Hello, my name is Jack Boville, and I'm the chair of the English Spelling Society. I extend a very warm welcome to all of you who are participating in the International English Spelling Congress, whether you are present at a physical meeting or via your computer in your own homes through the medium of the internet. I hope that those of you present in cyberspace are receiving us well, and that you will find the next couple of hours stimulating and inspiring. This event has taken quite some time in its preparation. The rationale for it was that spelling reformers had spent too long debating among themselves what kind of alternative spelling system might replace the current spelling system. Agreement seemed far distant, divided as participants were between those who sought radical solutions, those who preferred a more conservative approach, and those who were somewhere between on the opinion spectrum. Those differences have not disappeared, but it is our hope that by opening up the debate to the whole English-speaking world, to ordinary people who were not necessarily committed to spelling reform, but were prepared to approach the issue with an open mind, it may be possible to find an alternative that improves access to literacy, while at the same time avoiding the kind of changes that are off-putting to the wider public. This ideal compromise is the main goal of the Congress. Whether we achieve it remains to be seen. The other theme of the Congress is that, in the short term at any rate, we cannot expect reform to be imposed by governments. For reasons that will be explained later in the session, politicians are not likely to be reform-minded in the immediate future. Accordingly, the plan is that this Congress will eventually choose an alternative spelling system. That system will be promoted as a voluntary and transitional basis to run alongside current spelling. The hope is that it will eventually become the new norm throughout the English-speaking world. From the chosen alternatives can be promoted in something that this session, and more particularly the second session of the Congress, will wish to discuss. Well, we shall see what this produces. We have thrown a pebble into the pond, and we shall see what ripples it produces. The more the ripples resemble a giant wave, the more productive this Congress will have been. Before the session starts, just a couple of administrative matters. The guidance that will be discussed today is already published in draft on the Society's website. I also refer you to our plans in detail, another web page on our site that sets out how this session and subsequent events are designed to unfold. There will now follow some messages of welcome, followed by 4 talks on various aspects of English spelling and its improvement. There will then be an open session during which you can exchange comments and ask questions by means of the keyboard. Everyone will be able to see the comments as they come on. If you feel you have not got your comment through by the end of the session, then please use our blog after the session to do so. This session will be recorded and made available on the Society's website. So welcome once more to a productive couple of hours. But before we start with our talks, here are 2 messages of support. The first from our president, Professor Anatoly Lieberman. The second is from Alan Mole, chair of our sister organization, the American Literacy Council, whose financial contribution to this Congress we gratefully acknowledge.
It is an honor and a great pleasure for me to be able to welcome the Congress for which we have waited so long. Our common cause is to make English more accessible to all those who use it, both native speakers and foreigners, grown under the burden of English spelling. They have to learn that spell has 2 L's, and dispel has 1, that knock has a useless letter at the beginning, while have, unlike behave, has a useless letter at the end. And the most important thing of all, that there is often an insurmountable wall between the written image of an English word and its pronunciation. Builders and building, barriers and burial, bosom, and hundreds of other words have become puzzling hieroglyphics that stand between the learners and the language they are trying to master. Time and again, we hear that English spelling cannot be reformed because the change will be too disruptive. Yet nothing can be more disruptive than what we already have. Spelling reform, like all reforms, is destined to face resistance. Yet many other countries have shaken off the outdated inheritance of the Middle Ages and later centuries in this area, and alleviated the burden of learning their languages. There is no reason why we cannot or shouldn't follow the example. Nowhere else is spelling reform overdue to such an extent as in the English-speaking world. Experience shows that societal changes may and do occur when their benefits become clear to the population. It seems that only yesterday a virile man, to look attractive, had to reek of tobacco. Today, smoking is no longer a virtue. Some 70 years ago, we hardly knew the word recycling. Nowadays, recycling bins stand at every corner. If millions of people all over the world could be persuaded to use dental floss, should we not hope that they may also agree to such a healthy change as reforming English spelling? I, for one, hope that we, the reformers, will prevail, and that this Congress will become the turning point in our endeavor to make English spelling more logical and user-friendly to the world. Millions of hours being now wasted on instruction, and tons of money being spent with minimal benefits will be saved, and buckets of tears will be dried if we succeed. Welcome and good luck.
Good morning, I'm Alan Mole, President of the American Literacy Council, an American Spelling Reform Society. Our name refers to literacy because our foolish, unruly spelling is such an impediment to learning to read and write. We have twice the rate of illiteracy of a language with a systematic orthography that follows its own rules. We are excited about this Congress because it may unite reformers from all over the world behind a single rational system. We will participate, and we wish it well. Thank you.
Our first talk is on why is English spelling so irregular? It is given by Masha Bell, who is a long-standing advocate of spelling reform and has written many books on the subject. Her main interest over the past 2 decades has been to establish which irregularities of English spelling are most responsible for making learning to read and write much more difficult and time-consuming than other alphabetically written languages. She first realized that English spelling is much less transparent than other orthographies when she began to learn it at the age of 14 after Lithuanian and Russian. Her subsequent studies of German, French, Italian and Spanish confirmed her initial view.
This is about the English spelling system. When you first started to learn to read and write, and you came across spellings like much money, one woman, you probably thought that this was a bit weird. But you were told by your teachers, oh, it's okay, there are good reasons for it, you'll find out later. And anyway, with a bit of effort, anybody can learn it, so just get on and learn it. Well, it is a weird system. Ideally, English would have just 44 spellings because it has 44 sounds. So, for example, the A sound would be as an at, and no exceptions, A as an aim, as an air. I mean, it could be something else, but they would have just one spelling. In fact, English has 205 spellings for its 44 sounds, because most of them have a main pattern and exceptions. Now, if we look at the first one, A, that's not too bad. It's spelled mostly as an at, cat, sat. And it has just 3 exceptions. It's in plat, plaid, and meringue. But if we look at A, number 2, things get much more complicated. The main spelling is as in late, and date, and mate. But you can see here, there are lots of other ways of spelling the A sound as well, as in wait, and the other weight, and straight, and so forth. So 69 words have a different spelling. When it comes to the ain ending, it's mostly A-I-N, but again there are exceptions. And the same for an A sound at the very end. It's mostly AY, but again, there are exceptions. And so it goes on. I mean, just showing you here the next 5 sounds and their spellings. And it goes on like that for many pages. But knowing all the different ways that English can be spelled is still not enough to become a good speller of English, because you have to learn word by word when to use which. So if we take the example of the E sound in eat, eel, achieve, adhere, then there's no rule for deciding which one is right. You just have to learn it word by word. And altogether, at least 4,219 words have irregular spellings. I looked at the 7,000 most common ones, and that's what I found. So those irregular spellings actually fill 10 closely typed pages. You can see them all on my English Spelling Problems blog. And that's why even just learning to spell moderately well, not becoming a really hot speller, takes you about 10 years, so by about age 16. But if you want to become really good, it really takes longer. I mean, most really good spellers don't become good until the end of their higher education. And if we take this by contrast with Finnish pupils learn to spell pretty well in just 1 year instead of our 10. So by age 8, they can spell pretty well. Now, the other problem is that English isn't just learning to write English that's difficult, but learning to read is difficult too. So you have lots of spellings that you have to learn. You learn a pattern like food, mood, brood, and then you learn the exceptions. But for reading, you find that the same letters have different sounds. So you've learned mood and food and brood, but it's also pronounced as in good and flood. Or bone, stone, it's also pronounced as in, the O-N-E is pronounced as in done, gone, move. And that means that learning to read is difficult as well. Altogether, 69 English spellings have more than one pronunciation. And about 2,000 words have got tricky letters, letters with variable sounds in them. So children start by learning the patterns, and, man, can, ran, and then it's any, many. On, often, only, once, other. And again, all those are to be found on my blog too. And the differences in learning to read are very significant. So if you take countries with easy, simple spelling systems like Finland, Estonia, and Korea, children learn to read in 3 months. In their first term at school, they learn to read fluently. And by the time they go on to secondary school, there are very, very few kids that can't read. In the UK, the US, Australia, Canada, by contrast, to just read reasonably well, not exceptional words, just most ordinary words, takes about 3 years. Not 3 months, but 3 years. And by the time kids start secondary school, 1 in 5 are still struggling with reading. They're still not reading very well. Now, the long time that is needed for learning to read and write English has lots of other disadvantages as well. There are far more children than in countries with better spelling systems that are not reading and writing well. And because it takes so long, those who don't learn early have a hard time catching up later. There's more pressure on parents to help with homework, to help with reading. So the quality of your parents, what your parents are like, has quite an important impact on how well you do at school. I will tell you more about these things another time. But for now, if you just want to take a closer look at what English spelling is really like, have a look at my English Spelling Problems blog. It explains the system and all the different costs that come from having such an exceptionally bad spelling system. Bye-bye.
Our next talk is on the economic and social costs of English spelling. It is given by Norman Patterson, who is Secretary to the English Spelling Society and a member of its committee. His career was in commercial, scientific and systems programming, culminating in the University of St Andrews, where he received a doctorate for a thesis in genetic programming with context-sensitive grammars. Now retired, he has spent the last few years assisting the learning support staff of his local primary school, where he tutors children who have difficulty learning to read.
I would like to be able to say that the irregularity of English spelling costs X million pounds per year. Such a statement would be quite impossible to justify given our current state of knowledge. However, research has been and is being carried out in this area, and some quantitative results are available, which I will describe in this talk. It may be helpful to understand why this data is hard to come by. The difficulty stems from the fact that this is a question in social sciences, not chemistry or physics. We would like to compare English spelling with other languages, but we cannot isolate spelling and carry out controlled experiments. Spelling is just one of many factors that are bundled together with different syllable structures, different grammars, different schooling ages, different cultural backgrounds, different teaching methods, and so on. But we cannot stand still and wait for conclusive proof before taking action. Decisions have to be made on all sorts of political, social, and educational questions before we have all the facts. We hope that alert researchers can analyse these real-life experiments and extract some useful information from them, though it must be noted that not all government educational policy is based on evidence. In this talk, I look at the results of several studies. In section 1, I look at 2 studies about how children learn to read and spell in different languages. This involves language comparison and the psychology of language acquisition. Section 2 is about a study that measures how much money the UK spends on teaching children literacy in primary schools in England. Section 3 deals with a study into the costs of poor literacy over a longer period, namely from leaving primary school to age 37 years, again in England. All these studies have been carried out since the year 2000. A fair criticism of this talk is that they are all United Kingdom based. In such a short talk, it is hard to avoid imbalance like this. In 2003, Philip Seymour published Early Reading Development in European Orthographies. In this study, Seymour compares several European languages, including English. These languages differ in many ways, not just in terms of the language itself. The slide shows how errors in reading relate to the syllable complexity of the language. Languages with simple syllables, such as consonant-vowel, are shown on the left. Languages with complex syllables, such as consonant-vowel-consonant, are shown on the right. It can be seen that English-speaking children have a far higher error rate than any of the others, and that English also has the most complex syllable structure. Seymour reaches the rather startling conclusion that English-speaking children take about 2 years longer than other European children to reach the same level of literacy. This is typical of what these comparisons show. While we have not yet been able to show that English spelling is the smoking gun, the circumstantial evidence shows up time and again. We may argue about the extent to which English irregular spelling contributes to poor literacy, but to deny that it has any effect would be perverse. In 2010, Eduardo Quintanilla studied the development of reading in Spanish and English-speaking children to compare a regular spelling language, Spanish, with an irregular spelling language, English. The same children at various ages were asked to match pictures and words, as shown above. The experiments measured speed and accuracy. The slide shows a typical test. Here, the child has to match the picture on the left with a word on the right. If the child performed as shown, they would score 80% on this test. The children are rated for speed, words per minute, and accuracy, correct answers in 1 minute. The results for accuracy are shown in the slide. Spanish is the red line on the left, English is blue on the right. I will explain the green lines in a moment. The horizontal axis shows when the children were tested between February 2009 and June 2010. The same two groups of children were tested 4 times. The vertical axis shows the children's accuracy in matching pictures and words from 0 to 100%. Each dot on the red or blue lines shows the average score of the children in one test. The first red dot shows that the average score of the children was 60%. As we might expect, the Spanish-speaking children have greater accuracy than the English-speaking. Spanish is easier to learn than English. This is no longer any surprise. But look closely at the shape of the coloured lines. The red line is beginning to level out. The blue line is rising. The Spanish-speaking children, who are approaching a score of 100%, are reaching the point where they have learned all there is to know about reading Spanish. The English children still have a long way to go. The green lines also tell an important story. Look again at the leftmost red dot. This is the average score of 190 children. Naturally, there's a spread of ability, and this spread is shown by the green lines. When the green lines are far apart, there is a wide spread. When the green lines are close together, the spread is less. Note how the green lines narrow for the Spanish-speaking children, but not for the English-speaking children. Almost all Spanish-speaking children achieve a high score of around 100%. The English-speaking children remain widely spread. This one diagram shows the sad fact that too many English-speaking children are, for whatever reason, going to be left behind when it comes to literacy. It's an abstract diagram, but the message is very real. In 2007, the Society commissioned Zuzana Koterkova of Coventry University to carry out research to determine the monetary cost of teaching literacy in primary schools in England. Koterkova designed and implemented a survey to obtain the necessary information, asking teachers how much time they spent teaching literacy, along with several other questions. The findings are recorded in the economic cost of current English spelling. The slide shows the kind of question that the survey asked and the resulting figures, which arrive at £556 per teacher per year. That figure scales up to about £102 million per annum. To put this in context, the UK central and local government spending on pre-primary and primary education, in 2007 was about £600 million. This means that about 17% of government spending on primary education goes on literacy. This figure is only the net salary cost of primary school teaching in England. It would have to be increased by 10 or 20% to include the rest of the UK. It also does not include employment overheads such as pensions, nor does it include teaching materials, classroom assistants, or any of the other costs borne by children or their parents. In 2006, KPMG commissioned the Every Child a Chance Trust to investigate the long-term costs of literacy difficulties. Long-term means from leaving primary school to age 37 years, and by extrapolation to lifetime estimates. As far as I can tell, this study refers only to England. The findings are recorded in the second edition of the report, Long-Term Costs of Literacy Difficulties. The trust has since been wound up. The study identifies 6 types of cost. From largest to smallest, these are employment, lost taxes and unemployment benefit, education in 2 parts. First, the costs of special needs and adult education, and secondly, the cost of disciplinary problems. The 4th category is crime and the cost of the involvement with the criminal justice system. The 5th category is health, which includes costs of depression and obesity. And the 6th category is NEET, or not in education, employment or training. These are costs such as substance abuse and teenage pregnancy. The total comes to between 198 million and £2.5 billion per year. This is a very wide range, showing that the numbers are quite uncertain. Also, the costs are conservative, with a small c, as they only include those costs that are well quantified. I'd like to put that figure in context, but I'm not sure what context is relevant. It's a small part of the entire UK central and local government spending for fiscal year 2009. That was about £634 billion. If it's a small proportion, does that mean we should do nothing about it? If it were comparable to, say, the cost of the fire and rescue service, what would that mean? Not that I know if it is comparable. As well as estimating costs, the report identifies savings that could be expected from early intervention to address difficulty with literacy. The conclusion is an annual saving of about 55 million, with a high certainty, up to about 1.2 billion with less certainty. Money can only be spent once. If it is spent shoring up the effects of poor literacy, then it is lost to every other cause that we might prefer to spend it on. Shoring up does not achieve anything long term. It simply repairs the damage year after year without ever doing anything to prevent the damage from occurring in the next year. This is surely the definition of wasting money. This slide breaks down the employment-related costs. While lost taxes may seem merely a question of money changing hands between taxpayer and government, it should be remembered that what lost taxes actually imply is the lost productivity which would have resulted in those taxes. Thus, the nation as a whole loses twice. The report describes its figures as conservative because they do not include savings that could not readily be quantified, such as those listed in this slide. Take a moment to read this list and to think what these words mean. The costs may not be quantified, but they are very real to the people who endure them. Surely no one would wish to inflict or perpetuate the misery that these headings imply. The first conclusion is that Disentangling cause and effect in social sciences is never easy. We will never find 100% certain proof of anything. But we don't demand 100% certainty before enacting policies in other areas, and there's no reason to do so for literacy. Second conclusion. The evidence that we do have always points in the same direction. It would be perverse to ignore it. Finally, the costs that we can identify are significant. They are both economic, hard cash, and social, life-changing. These costs are borne in part by the very people least able to afford them, starting in childhood. We all pay something through taxation and government spending, or through lost productivity.
Our next talk is on the history of spelling reform and why it hasn't made much progress so far. It is delivered by Nigel Hilton, who is a member of the Society's committee and also a trustee of the Society. It is read by a member of the Secretariat.
To be brutally honest, English spelling in the United Kingdom and Commonwealth hasn't changed much since Dr. Johnson published his dictionary in 1755, and American spellings are still essentially the same as they appeared in Noah Webster's dictionary in 1828. Numerous attempts have been made to make English spelling more predictable and regular since then, but none has had much success. This talk will try to explain the reasons for this impasse and consider what are the prospects for reform in the future. Let's go back to the earliest days of spelling reform. For a variety of reasons, English spelling was already pretty irregular by the 16th century. But it was more fluid than today and not yet standardized. Variant spellings were more common. There was also a slightly more tolerant attitude towards spelling reform. Scholars such as Alexander Gill, headmaster of St. Paul's School, London, and James Howell, an Anglican priest, both proposed simplification. Howell's rather conservative efforts bore some fruit. For example, logic spelt L-O-G-I-Q-U-E became L-O-G-I-C, and sin spelt S-I-N-N-E became S-I-N as today. Shakespeare satirized linguistic and spelling pedants. In Love's Labour's Lost, he makes fun of Holofernes, who wanted people to pronounce the silent B in debt and dumb. Reform went backwards in the 18th century, however. This was due in part to the increasing influence on scholars of Greek and Latin literature. They tried to link English words to their Greek or Latin counterparts. This resulted in many silent and redundant letters being introduced into words whose spelling was previously more phonetic. Thus debt, D-E-T, became det, D-E-B-T, and doubt, D-O-U-T, became doubt, D-O-U-B-T. Some of these changes resulted from mistaken etymology. For example, an S was introduced into the spelling of island in the belief that the origin of the word was from insula, the Latin. In fact, the word came from the Old English Igland, I-G-L-A-N-D. Dr. Johnson, great lexicographer that he was, added to the complexity and irregularity of English spelling. He attached little value to making words spelt as they were pronounced. His main concern was to establish what was the most common spelling at the time. And he added to the complexity by introducing different spellings for words that sounded the same but had different meanings, i.e. homophones. The principal reformer in the 19th century was the American lexicographer Noah Webster. His American Dictionary of the English Language, published in 1828, set out spellings that Webster believed to be the most common in the USA. These contained some divergences from modern UK usage, although in many cases the two versions were both in use on either side of the Atlantic. Thus, OUR became OR in words such as labour. Words ending in RE were written ER, as in centre. Words ending in NCE were written NSE, as in defence, and the ending ISE was written IZE. However, Webster abandoned many of his additional proposed changes in the face of conservative opposition. He had 26 proposals that were never implemented, including spelling cloak as C-L-O-K-E and near as N-E-E-R. But the spelling reform movement did gather momentum in the course of the 19th century. Isaac Pitman, the inventor of phonetic shorthand, pleaded for phonetic spelling. The International Convention for Amendment of English Orthography in 1876 was followed by the establishment of various spelling bodies on both sides of the Atlantic. The American Philological Association produced 24 spelling reform proposals. In the USA, the spelling reform movement reached its apogee under Theodore Roosevelt. He was very much influenced by Andrew Carnegie, industrialist and philanthropist, who had set up and financed the Simplified Spelling Board. The board was proposing the adoption of 300 respellings, some of them based on Webster's unimplemented proposals. Roosevelt tried to introduce these by executive order to the government printing office. They soon encountered opposition, and the House of Representatives voted to oppose the new spellings on 13th December 1906. Roosevelt had to admit defeat. There were various reasons for his failure. Roosevelt was too hasty. He had failed to consult the Simplified Spelling Board, and his proposals were probably too extensive for immediate acceptance. There had been no public consultation, and Congress was jealous of any abuse of executive power. But the reform movement was not dead. The Simplified Spelling Society, now known as the English Spelling Society, was set up in England in 1908 with support from leading figures. Today, with the American Literacy Council, it is the principal advocate of reform. Montfollick, a British MP, tried to introduce legislation in the UK in the early 50s, but the bills never received royal assent. Sir James Pitman's initial teaching alphabet was a phonemic teaching tool, but it failed due to lack of support in schools. Looking back on these failures, one can identify a number of reasons. All spelling reform tends to encounter opposition, and this has been demonstrated in other countries. Human nature is innately conservative, especially on matters affecting everyday life. But English spelling reform has particular obstacles. For a start, our spelling system is so irregular compared with other spelling systems. Not only can one not predict the spelling from the pronunciation, but you can't always predict the pronunciation from the spelling, the so-called double whammy, so the task of any reform is so much the greater. Any reform that made any substantial improvement in access to literacy would require a number of respellings, and these could amount to 15% as a minimum. Opponents are devoted to their hoary chestnuts, for example, loss of connection with etymological origins, problems with homophones, and accusations of dumbing down. There are robust answers to these chestnuts, but opponents trot them out without thinking the issue through. In particular, opponents make assumptions about the kind of reform that would be implemented, and assume that it would inevitably be highly radical or phonemic. Add to the previous reasons the political and geographical elements. There is no English equivalent of the Académie Française or the Real Academia to rule on matters of English grammar and spelling, and governments in the English-speaking world have never seen it as their function to get involved in spelling reform. There are no votes in it. Former colonies might well be suspicious of any spelling initiatives coming from the former colonial master, the United Kingdom. Conversely, many in the United Kingdom resent the introduction of American spellings as cultural imperialism, and might resist reforms which were essentially US-based. And it should be noted that opposition to Roosevelt's reforms was particularly virulent in England. The failure of reformers to agree on a single alternative spelling system has hampered the cause of reform, and there continues to be a large rift between radicals and conservatives on this issue. Finally, the debate among reformers has been characterized by dogged pursuit of authors' own schemes, and a refusal to see any merit in the arguments of the other side. Despite this history of failure, there are at the moment some hopeful signs. Increasing independent research shows the link between irregularity of spelling and delayed access to literacy, as in Selwyn's research. Despite much funding of new teaching methods, no method has been found that deals satisfactorily with the problem of irregularity in spelling. There is continuing concern on both sides of the Atlantic over functional illiteracy, and there is plenty of evidence of the link between functional illiteracy and crime, social deprivation, and unemployment. The younger generation is more likely to challenge the old hoary chestnuts on spelling, and texting shows the willingness of younger people to experiment with spelling. Modern technology addresses some of the objections to spelling reform. With new software, text could be switched between traditional to reformed spelling and back at the click of a button, so there is no need to reprint everything, at least not immediately. Finally, perhaps at last, reformers are getting their act together, trying to agree among themselves, and bringing in the wider public into the discussions. We shall see.
The next talk is entitled IESC, The Plans in Detail. As the title suggests, it sets out the detail of the arrangements for the Congress project, how it was conceived, and how it is planned to unfold over the next couple of years. It is given by Stephen Lindstead. Stephen is a retired civil servant. He lives in Solihull in the West Midlands of England. He is a former chair of the English Spelling Society and is currently its treasurer.
Well, we have heard about why English spelling is so irregular compared with the spelling systems of other languages. We have heard how much this irregularity costs English-speaking countries socially and economically. We have heard the rather dismal story of past attempts at spelling reform. This talk will explain the Congress project in greater detail and why we hope it will be more successful than previous attempts. Essentially, the Congress project seeks to avoid some of the problems that have frustrated earlier attempts at reform. Let's go through these one by one. Let's face it, spelling reform is not the kind of cause that your average politician is going to take up with much enthusiasm at the present moment. There have been honourable exceptions. However, for the most part, politicians tend to pursue policies which are popular, and most will have concluded, probably rightly, that there are few votes at the moment in spelling reform. People are naturally conservative, especially about things that affect everyday living, and they resent government intrusion in these matters. Theodore Roosevelt in the USA and Follett in the United Kingdom rapidly ran into the buffers when they tried a top-down approach through executive action and legislation respectively. So the Congress, rather than seeking aid from governments at the moment, is looking to a more bottom-up populist approach. The idea is that if one can secure some kind of broad consensus among a sufficient number of ordinary people throughout the English-speaking world on what might be both effective and acceptable, there is a greater long-term chance of success. This assumes that an acceptable alternative would spread at grassroots level to a degree that governments and the academic establishment eventually would make such alternatives official. When I say ordinary people, don't misunderstand me. I am all too well aware that for some, any change to spelling whatsoever is anathema, and likely to bring out all the hoary chestnuts of opposition. These chestnuts are legion, and spring for the most part from ignorance and a rush to judgment. There are weighty counter-arguments to each. However, we have to face the fact that for some, perhaps many in the English-speaking world, spelling change is a horrifying idea, tantamount to cultural sacrilege, and English spelling is not alone in having such strong supporters of the status quo. There are nevertheless some grounds for optimism. While the full membership of the English Spelling Society is modest, associate members, who do not pay any subscription, number over 1,000, and more are joining every week. And the correspondence we have with inquirers suggests that there are many who are not persuaded by the hoary chestnuts, and are vaguely sympathetic to spelling reform, even if they are not wedded to any specific changes. It is at the heart of this project that we should open up the debate to as many people as possible, particularly to those whose minds are not closed to the possibility of change. Why should the general public be any wiser, or their contribution more valid, than the experts? Well, there are two reasons essentially. The first, already mentioned, is that the wider the involvement of ordinary people, the greater the chance that a critical mass will develop, which governments and academia have to take seriously. The case will grow for the alternative spelling arrangements to be tolerated running alongside conventional spelling in educational establishments and in official correspondence. The second reason is that, frankly, the debate on spelling reform has been rather inward-looking over the past 100 years. Since 1908, when the English Spelling Society was founded, an enormous amount of information has emerged on English and other spelling. Just look at the publications and research pages on our website, and that has been very valuable. However, the fact is that those wedded to reform have never agreed on what should replace traditional spelling, even though a considerable number of alternative schemes have been produced by members of spelling organisations and others. Reformer has spoken to reformer, sometimes less than cordially, and the debate has sometimes been rancorous. Indeed, there is a clause in the constitution of the Society that permits members to be expelled for intolerance of the views of others. It has not been invoked recently, but its existence is testimony to how heated the debate can get at times. We want to avoid such rancour in the proceedings of the Congress, and we hope that participants in this enterprise will display the tolerance and goodwill that is essential to its success. Hopefully, the involvement of those who come relatively new to this debate will open up some new insights and perspectives. There is another theme which we hope will run through the sessions. It can be argued that given the high degree of irregularity in English spelling, only major changes are worthwhile, and that while we are about it, we should aim for the degree of predictability to be found in spelling systems such as Spanish, Italian and Finnish. The so-called double whammy would totally disappear. One would be able to predict the spelling of English from the pronunciation, and the pronunciation from the spelling, so-called two-way phonymicity. According to that argument, it doesn't matter that people would have to accept a high degree of change, perhaps over 75% of words in the dictionary. It will be worth it in the end because access to literacy will be greatly increased. Those on the other side of the argument believe that, given natural conservatism, such tactics will ensure that the end is never achieved, and that one should aim only for minimal change, which will remove only the worst examples of irregular spellings. The objection to such conservatism is that a minimalist approach will probably not achieve very much despite all the effort put into it, and that it might not even produce the one-way phonymicity to be found in most other spelling systems, i.e., when one can predict the pronunciation from the spelling, if not vice versa. No doubt we shall have a variety of such views expressed today and throughout the Congress. The decision will, at the end of the day, be up to the participants. Radical and conservative schemes may both be submitted. However, the guidelines for authors and the expert commission, as currently drafted, and I stress that they are only a draft at the present moment, do suggest that compromise is not a dirty word, and that schemes which try to reconcile maximum access to literacy with avoiding quite unnecessary changes are to be commended. Whether we manage to achieve such an ideal compromise remains, of course, to be seen. Finally, some detail about the way in which the Congress will proceed from now on. After these talks have finished, there will be an open session. You will be free to contribute by typing messages on your keyboard. These will be visible to all of you, and after the first session you can post any comments you want on our blog. We shall open a new thread specifically for post-session debate. These proceedings, including the open session, will be recorded and made available via our website. The next step is finalization of the guidelines for those submitting schemes and for the expert commission. Immediately thereafter, we hoped to appoint the expert commission. We decided to wait until after the first session before making appointments, firstly to see if we had any volunteers for this task, secondly to enable participants to suggest additional candidates. The names will be announced shortly after the revised guidelines have been published. It will then be open to authors wishing to submit alternative schemes to send them in for consideration. The schemes will have to comply with a template to ensure that they can be compared easily and that all necessary information is supplied to the expert commissioners. The schemes will be examined by volunteers who will make sure that the scheme fits the template's requirements before it is forwarded, but they will not comment on the merits of the scheme, which is down to the commissioners. There will be a period of about 6 months during which authors can submit their schemes, dating from the time when invitations to submit are issued, hopefully fairly soon after this first session. We have to have some deadline, because otherwise the process of examining them would drag on indefinitely. The essential task of the commissioners will be to select a short list of about 6 from the schemes submitted. Ideally, any scheme submitted that complied with the template would be voted on in the final vote. However, we could have quite a large number of schemes submitted, and it seemed desirable to reduce the final choice to manageable proportions. Nevertheless, in order to provide the voters with a range of options, the commissioners will be asked to select some that are more radical than others. The shortlist, when produced, will be published on the Society's website, and there will be the opportunity for further discussion and comment. Sometime in 2019, there will be a second session of the Congress. This will discuss the schemes submitted, as well as future arrangements for publicising and encouraging the use of the selected alternative. Firstly, the opportunity to register will remain open after the first session of the Congress. Those who register after the first session will have the same opportunity as earlier comers to take part in the second session and vote on the final selection. In fact, registrations will remain open until just before the second session. Secondly, it is likely that a number of people on the committee of the Society, or associated with it, will wish to submit schemes of their own. It is important to encourage a wide range of schemes for consideration by the commissioners and the participants. However, it is also important to ensure that the Congress is seen to be conducted fairly and that any conflicts of interest are managed. Accordingly, no person who submits a scheme will be allowed to be on the expert commission. They will not be allowed to sift their own submissions. They will not be allowed to take part in the final vote, and, if a member of the committee of the Society, will not be able to take part in any decisions on the final form of the guidelines. We hope that these precautions will guarantee a fair and transparent Congress in which the public can have confidence.
Our last talk concerns the guidance document, which is accessible via the Society's website. As this draft was issued with the authority of the Society's committee, it is presented by the Secretariat. This talk is about the guidance, an exposure draft that was published on the Society's website when applications were opened in January 2018. It is intended to guide authors who wish to submit schemes to the Expert Commission and to be of assistance to the Commission in making decisions on shortlisting. The guidance document is currently only a draft. It will be finalised by the Test Committee after this session is completed, taking account of comments received. The underlying theme of the Congress is to improve access to literacy by simplifying current English spelling, but also avoiding unnecessary changes which may make it more difficult for the approved scheme to obtain wide support in the English-speaking world. The rest of this talk explains the guidance in greater detail. Generally, the points raised are not formal instructions, but authors are asked to bear them in mind when submitting their schemes. The one formal requirement is that all schemes should follow a prescribed template. This will be published on the website after the first session. It is designed to ensure that the commissioners have all the details they need in carrying out their shortlisting and that they can more easily compare the various submissions. It will cater for a wide variety of submissions, including both conservative and radical. The Commission will be free to suggest changes to a submission if they think it has promise but could be improved by certain additions, omissions or alterations. The author can accept or reject the Commission's suggestions. Equally, the Commission will be free not to shortlist a scheme whose author has declined suggested changes. Diacritics or accents alter the pronunciation of a letter, for example the French acute. Special letters are ones, perhaps found in other languages, which help to indicate pronunciation, but which do not feature in the modern English alphabet, for example the German sign for the double S sound as in hiss. Some authors of schemes include diacritics and or special letters. Such use will not disqualify a scheme, but authors are asked to consider whether these are really necessary to achieve their objectives, and whether they could actually be replaced by ordinary letters of the current alphabet. This caution stems from concerns about the costs of introducing diacritics and special letters, and the fear that such innovations may deter English speakers from using the alternative scheme. If diacritics or special letters are to be used, the author should justify this in the submission. Graphemes are letters or combinations of letters that represent phonemes, sounds. Authors are asked to consider using a grapheme which can currently be used to represent a particular phoneme before adopting a totally new one. This suggestion is made in the interests of avoiding unnecessary change. It does not mean that no new graphemes can be introduced, especially when there is no distinctive way of representing that particular sound in current spelling. In English, there are many ways of representing a particular sound. This adds to the complexity of our current spelling. Additionally, a number of letters or letter combinations can represent more than one sound, and there may be no reliable rules to indicate when a particular sound is represented. Authors may wish to consider reducing this complexity, but this does not mean that a scheme will be disqualified if it allows a phoneme to be represented by more than one grapheme. In such circumstances, reliable rules to indicate when a particular pronunciation is appropriate are to be commended. Schemes that require significantly more characters to represent a text than current spelling are likely to impede general acceptance. Conversely, schemes that require fewer characters than in current spelling will have cost benefits. They are to be commended, providing this does not become shorthand or represent unnecessary change. It is quite common for authors of alternative spelling schemes to retain a number of words in their original and irregular spellings. This is to reduce changes to familiar words and so to increase the prospects of acceptance. Authors are free to retain these spellings, but they should consider whether the number of such words will frustrate their easy memorization by children and students of English as a second language. Schemes of a more conservative nature often rely on rules to indicate when a letter or letter combination can represent one particular sound rather than another. Current spelling already contains many such rules. The problem is that it frequently doesn't follow them. Authors should consider whether any rules they decide to introduce are reasonably reliable and that there are not too many of them. Authors proposing that their scheme be implemented in stages rather than all at once are asked to explain when and by whom such incremental change would be initiated. As governments are unlikely to take on this role, there would presumably have to be some other body in charge. Authors should set out their ideas about this. They're also asked to consider how conflicts with current spelling would be managed. At present, current spelling, whether it be of the US or Commonwealth variety, can be interpreted by the main dialects of spoken English in accordance with their own separate traditions. Thus, an American or Scot would pronounce the word learn sounding the R, whereas some other accents would suppress it. If a scheme can only be interpreted easily in accordance with one particular regional accent, then this is likely to impede its global acceptance. Authors should see if they can devise schemes that do not run into this problem. Using different spellings for different accents is to be discouraged, but this does not rule out different spellings where pronunciation is so divergent that it can't be represented by a common grapheme. It would frustrate the purposes of the Congress if the scheme, as finally approved, could not be used freely by anyone. For example, the author might demand royalties or impose other restrictions for its use. Accordingly, authors will be asked to give a legally binding undertaking that their scheme, if finally approved, will be royalty-free and free of any other restrictions likely to inhibit its use. The authorship of the successful scheme will of course be acknowledged in the Congress annals.
There is a contingent which is pushing out and you don't have any. Excuse me. Before Jack Boville opens the open session, I'm Stephen Linstead, and you've already heard from me. I'd just like to say we're sorry that one or two people have had difficulties over the contact. I think most people have eventually managed to get video, but some people have had difficulty with audio. All I can say on that is that there are telephone numbers available. Most of these are local and some of these are toll-free, so if you haven't used those, do try that. Also, if you've got Skype or anything else running in the background, try switching that off, because that can interfere with this particular internet communication. Anyhow, we will do a wash-up after this session and perhaps learn lessons from it. We hope that most people have been able to see and hear clearly. We're about to have the open session now, and I'm going to pass over to Chairman Jack Boville, who will say a few words.
Hello. Hello. I shall be reading from a prepared document, well, we have concluded the first phase of this webinar. I hope you found it interesting. Thank you for staying with us for the past hour. There now follows an open session in which those participating are free to contribute, comment, and ask questions. Those at the physical meetings in London and Berkeley, I should say, will be able to be seen and heard. Others who are joining in from home can send in text using the keyboard on their personal computer. The text will be visible at the side of the screen to all those participating, although they will eventually roll off the screen. We shall be taking notes of comments made, text received, and we'll try to respond to most of them during this open session. Don't forget that these proceedings will be recorded and made available via our website over the next few days. You're free to text in at any time, but it would be helpful if you could do so after those attending the physical meetings have had their say, so that we can better take note of comments. We shall start off by inviting those present at the Berkeley meeting to come up and make their contribution. We will then open the floor to those in London. In view of the limited time available for the event, could I ask all of you at physical meetings to confine your comments to 5 minutes maximum. And after that, the floor will be free to texting. At a suitable point in the open session, I will draw a close to further comments and ask Stephen Linstead here to respond to as many points made as he's able to. I will then make my closing remarks, and there will be a short video clip of acknowledgements. And now over to Bob.
Hello, this is Timothy in Berkeley. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. We enjoyed it very much, and we look forward to going forward. So we don't have any particular questions, but we're interested in hearing what other people have to say. Thank you.
Okay, well, we'll now invite anybody in the London physical meeting to come up to the hot chair if they want to say anything. I think this open session is going to be rather short, as I don't have any people eager to seize the floor in London. I think I've been watching all the texts which have been exchanged so far. A lot of these are on the more technical aspects of spelling reform and phonology, and many of those have already been discussed on such forums as SoundSpell and SSS. These are, of course, all issues which need to be considered when we come to devise and debate the alternative spelling scheme. I think that as we don't seem to have had any requests for floor debate, the best thing is to invite people to spend a few minutes allowing people to text in any questions they want to ask about the way in which the IEOC is going to develop, about the guidance, about the expert commission, about the second session. If anybody likes to text in, particularly on those matters that I've mentioned, we'll have a few minutes so that people can have their say, and then we will wind up. I was, of course, always aware that the open session might not last the full amount of time that we'd allocated to it, but the floor is open to everybody who has a keyboard. Right. When will the template be made available? That's a good question. As soon as possible. But the guidance, which has been issued in draft, will have to be finalised, and that's a matter for the committee, for those members of the committee who are not going to be submitting schemes themselves. All I can say is as soon as possible. But the template will follow the guidance as finalised by the committee. I hope that answers that particular question. Sorry, not quite sure. I'm not sure about Unicode. It's a matter for discussion. Do I have a written schedule for the, not a precise one. The way we are going to proceed is to move as fast as possible with the finalization of the guidance and the drawing up of the template and recruiting the expert commission. I would hope that we could have achieved that in the next couple of months. As soon as the template is finalized, people will be invited to send in their schemes. Does that answer that question? Good. Which groups of English users will it be marketed for? Well, to be honest, we haven't given a great amount of thought to what happens after the conference has adopted a final choice of alternative schemes. That's one of the things that will be discussed at the second session of the Congress. But we have given some preliminary thoughts to this. We want to appeal to those who are most sympathetic, and we were thinking particularly of the student audience, of more sympathetic papers, or sympathetic members of academia. Those are our initial thoughts. We weren't really proposing to tackle government as yet. The basic philosophy of this project is that we try to get some enthusiasm for the approved scheme at ground roots level first, infiltrate academia and publishing, and get to a stage when the academic establishment will at least tolerate the alternative scheme, where people will not be marked down or prohibited from using it. Once one's got to a kind of tolerance level, then we hope perhaps the alternative may eventually overtake. It's a slow process, but it is bottom up. And as we've seen, top-down initiatives in the past have not been successful. Any more comments? Right. Mark Peterson, have you considered whether the scheme's proposal should simply state spelling rules, or should a full translation dictionary be required? Well, I think we were certainly thinking of some software. Once the new scheme is drawn up and approved, we were certainly thinking of getting some software which would enable traditional spelling to be seamlessly re-scripted into new. Are we not creating a potential problem by committing to setting a single spelling scheme, which is likely to... Well, interesting question, but I think we were thinking of one particular alternative. I don't honestly see how one could promote two alternatives in tandem. Test-driven. Any members? Well, yes, test-driven. I mean, we will try and get publications and periodicals perhaps to produce monthly articles or columns in the new system. Market research, we were going to conduct some market research. Funds did not permit it on a professional basis, but we will certainly planning that the shortlisted schemes will be promoted on the Society's website so people can look in and comment on them. Right. I think we'll perhaps allow another 5-10 minutes more for people to type in, shall we? Are people dying to opine? Well, that's an interesting comment by Philip Johnson Smith. Yes, I think you're probably right on that. Most foreigners find it difficult to understand why English is so irregular. I have to say that when I speak to people who learn English as a second language, spelling isn't the only problem. English is not quite so simple a language as we like to make out. The use of tenses is highly idiomatic, and that seems to be a stumbling block as well as spelling for foreigners. Well, Fred has commented about diacritics. We have emphasized in what's been said about guidance that diacritics in new letters are not prohibited by any means. There is a clear division between radicals and others on this issue. At the end of the day, there will be a short list of about 6, and the reconvened Congress will have to make up its mind on this. A lot of people still typing. Robert, yes, it will. The template will allows for diacritics in new letters, not ruled out by any means. Yeah, I have to say, Chuck, that the object of this Congress is an alternative scheme. Anything else comes under the category of teaching aids, I think, in which the society is interested. But the focus of this Congress is agreement on our alternative scheme. Well, what is radical and what is conservative is a subjective matter. I think we probably all recognize a radical alternative scheme when we see it and a conservative one when we see it, but it's difficult to define it precisely. Yes, I take Rachel's point about typing. Well, I think as far as Mark's comment about how it came about, it rather growed like Topsy. We didn't really start with any grand scheme. It evolved from discussions within the committee of the society. That's best to describe it. No, there is no skyscraper for the reform. Well, thank you, David, for that comment. Yes, we did have one or two problems. This was an experiment, but I think on the whole it's been successful, and thank you for your comment too. We will take note of Philip Johnson-Smith's suggestion. I think I'm going to, if people don't mind, we'll have 3 more comments, and then I think we probably need to draw stumps. There will be plenty of opportunity to comment through the blog after this session. Okay, folks. Well, thank you very much for all your contributions. People have been very busy typing this evening, and we really do appreciate all your input on this, which all of it will be recorded. We'll now turn to Jack, who will say a few concluding remarks.
Hello. I don't know if it's good evening or good morning, but whichever it is, I hope it's good. Well, this concludes the open session. Again, I'm reading from a prepared script. It's good to have so many contributions. We shall carefully consider all comments received and take these into account before finalising the guidance to authors. We shall then produce the template for authors to use in submitting their schemes, and the expert commission will be appointed as soon as possible. When we are in a position to invite authors to make their submissions, this will be announced on the Society's website. Those who have expressed their intention of making submissions will receive individual emails. remains for me to thank all those who have contributed to this first session of the IASC. I should like in particular to thank the American Literacy Council for their moral and financial support, and to the University of California for their kind hospitality and facilitation of the link up in Berkeley campus. Our thanks are due to London Video Conferencing for their part in registration arrangements and the transmission of this webinar, and to Stones Throw Limited for their editing of the pre-recording. Finally, I would like to thank all members of the committee of the Society for the various parts they have played in bringing this event to fruition. We shall now run a very short recorded conclusion to these proceedings. It's been very good. We hope to see you all at the second session. Au revoir till we meet again.
Okay.